The Great Salt Lake is evaporating into a toxic dust bowl, and the most visible symptom right now is a lakebed so exposed that more than half its floor lies bare under the desert sun. This is not a distant crisis waiting to unfold. This is happening now, in Utah, at the edge of a metro area where more than 2 million adults live, work, and breathe air that is already changing. The Great Salt Lake is the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere, a sprawling terminal basin fed by mountain streams that once carried snowmelt from the Wasatch Range down into a shallow bowl with no outlet. What flows in, stays in, and what leaves does so only through evaporation. For thousands of years, that balance held. The lake sat vast and salty, a shimmering inland sea visible from space, a hemispheric sanctuary for millions of migratory birds, and a biological engine powered by a single organism that thrives where almost nothing else can. The uniqueness of the Great Salt Lake rests on 3 pillars. First, it is a terminal lake, meaning water arrives but never departs except by turning into vapor. That makes every upstream decision about water a permanent downstream sentence. Second, the lake hosts extreme salinity, a brine so concentrated that it supports almost no fish, no predators, and no competition for the one creature that dominates, the brine shrimp. Third, it functions as a hemispheric bird sanctuary, a critical stopover and feeding ground for eared grebes, Wilson's phalaropes, and millions of other migratory species that time their journeys to the boom and bust cycles of shrimp. These 3 traits, terminal hydrology, extreme salinity, and avian importance, are not decorative facts. They are the architecture of the system, and they are all breaking at once. Under the hood, the Great Salt Lake operates as a simple but fragile machine. Inputs are mountain streams carrying snowmelt and rain. Processes are evaporation, which removes water but leaves salts behind, and biological productivity, which depends on salinity staying within a narrow band. Outputs are vapor, dust, and in better years, migratory birds fueled by shrimp. When inputs shrink and evaporation continues unchanged, the system does not pause, it concentrates. Salinity climbs, the lake shrinks, the lakebed emerges, and what was once submerged becomes airborne. The main causal chain is direct. Upstream water diversions, driven by agriculture, urban use, and prolonged drought, reduce the volume of fresh water reaching the lake. Evaporation, accelerated by warming temperatures, continues to pull water out of the basin. The lake surface drops. As the lake shrinks, salinity rises because the same load of dissolved salts is now dissolved in less water. When salinity exceeds the biological tolerance limits of brine shrimp, reproduction falters. Shrimp populations crash. Birds that depend on shrimp either starve, die in massive numbers, or abandon the lake entirely. Meanwhile, the receding waterline exposes vast stretches of lakebed, a crust loaded with salts, particulates, and trace metals. Wind picks up that crust and turns it into dust. The dust carries arsenic, selenium, and other toxics. It drifts towards cities. The lake, once a resource, becomes a weapon. Start with the brine shrimp. These tiny crustaceans are the only reason the Great Salt Lake supports life on such a massive scale. They tolerate salinity levels that would kill almost any other organism, thriving in concentrations up to around 30%. But thriving and surviving are not the same thing. The ideal salinity range for brine shrimp reproduction sits between 12 and 16%. Within that band, populations explode, turning the water into a living soup that draws birds by the millions. Above that range, reproduction slows. Eggs fail to hatch, populations thin, and when salinity climbs too high, even these extremophiles cannot maintain their numbers. The mechanism is simple. Brine shrimp evolved to exploit a niche where competition is absent, but that niche has boundaries. When the lake shrinks and salinity exceeds those boundaries, the niche collapses. The loss is equally simple. In parts of the lake, salinity now regularly exceeds the 12 to 16% ideal, and in some areas it climbs even higher. Brine shrimp populations have crashed. Commercial harvest, once a multi-million-dollar industry, has been suspended since 2022. The reality check is this. The boats that used to harvest shrimp now sit idle. The water they once worked is either too salty or too shallow. The shrimp are gone. Now follow the birds. Eared grebes are small, sleek water birds that migrate through the Great Salt Lake in numbers that can reach into the millions. They stop here to feed, and what they feed on is brine shrimp. During peak migration, a single grebe can consume thousands of shrimp per day, building fat reserves for the next leg of the journey. The mechanism is straightforward. The lake provides a concentrated, reliable food source at a critical time in the migration calendar. The grebes arrive, they gorge, they leave. But when the shrimp crash, the food source disappears. The loss is visible. Massive die-offs of grebes have been documented. Some birds attempt to forage elsewhere, but alternative sites are scarce and often inadequate. Others simply starve. The reality check is empty skies over barren salt flats. Where there should be tens of thousands of birds, there are hundreds. Where there should be noise and motion, there is silence. Now turn to the lakebed itself. As of early 2026, the Great Salt Lake's surface elevation hovers around 4,192 feet in the South Arm. That figure might sound abstract, but it translates to roughly 53% of the lakebed now exposed to air. This is not a narrow fringe of beach. This is a vast, dry expanse of crustal salts, accumulated sediments, and trace metals deposited over centuries. The mechanism is this. When the lake was full, these materials stayed submerged and stable. When the water recedes, the crust dries, cracks, and becomes vulnerable to wind. The Great Basin is a windy place. Gusts lift particles from the exposed lakebed and carry them downwind. The loss is public health. The dust is not inert. It contains salts that irritate airways, particulates that penetrate deep into lungs, and trace metals like arsenic that pose long-term respiratory and carcinogenic risks. The reality check is air quality alerts in Salt Lake City and surrounding communities, respiratory complaints rising, and a growing awareness that the lake is no longer just shrinking, it is becoming a source of harm. The system is not breaking in isolation. Warming temperatures increase evaporation rates, pulling more water out of the lake, even when inflows remain constant. Prolonged drought reduces the snowpack in the mountains, cutting the volume of runoff that feeds the streams. Agricultural diversions, some dating back more than a century, siphon off water before it reaches the terminal basin. Urban growth increases demand. Each factor alone would stress the system. Together, they form a cascade. Less water arrives, more water evaporates. The lake shrinks faster, salinity climbs higher. The biological collapse deepens. The lakebed expands. The dust storms intensify. The cascade of consequences follows a clear sequence. First, brine shrimp populations collapse because salinity exceeds their reproductive tolerance. Second, migratory birds that depend on shrimp either die or abandon the lake, severing a hemispheric ecological link. Third, the exposed lakebed becomes a source of airborne toxics, threatening the respiratory health of nearby human populations. Fourth, the commercial shrimp industry, once a steady economic contributor, shuts down entirely. Fifth, The lake's role as a climate moderator, providing moisture and cooling to the region, diminishes. Sixth, the aesthetic and cultural value of the lake, a landmark visible from space and a source of regional identity, erodes. Each consequence is mechanically linked to the one before it. This is not a list of unrelated problems. This is a chain reaction. The human price is tangible. Adults who live near the lake face increased exposure to toxic dust, with respiratory risks that disproportionately affect those with pre-existing conditions. Outdoor workers, from construction crews to delivery drivers, breathe air that carries particles from a lakebed that should be underwater. Recreational use of the lake, already limited by high salinity, becomes even less viable as beaches turn into dust fields. The sense of place, the knowledge that a major inland sea sits at the edge of the urban area, fades as the lake becomes smaller, saltier, and more hostile. These are not abstract losses. They are daily experiences, diminished. The trajectory is conditional, but clear. If upstream diversions continue at current levels, if drought persists, if warming trends accelerate evaporation, the lake will continue to shrink. Surface elevations will drop further. More lakebed will be exposed. Salinity will climb higher. Brine shrimp populations will remain suppressed. Birds will continue to avoid the lake or arrive to find inadequate food. Dust storms will increase in frequency and intensity. Respiratory health impacts will grow. The lake will not disappear entirely. Terminal lakes rarely do, but it will become a fundamentally different body of water. Smaller, saltier, biologically impoverished, and toxic to the communities that surround it. What should you track? First, surface elevation. The critical threshold is around 4,190 feet. Below that, ecological collapse accelerates. As of March 2026, the South Arm sits near 4,192 feet, just above the danger line, but the margin is thin. Second, salinity levels. When readings consistently exceed 12 to 16% in the main feeding areas, brine shrimp reproduction fails. Third, brine shrimp harvest data. Suspension of commercial harvest since 2022 is a direct indicator of population collapse. Fourth, bird population counts during peak migration. Declining numbers, especially of species like eared grebes, signal that the food web is broken. Fifth, air quality measurements in nearby cities. Spikes in particulate matter and detectable arsenic levels confirm that the lakebed is becoming airborne. The Great Salt Lake is not dying from neglect. It is being starved by design. Every gallon of water diverted upstream is a gallon that will never reach the terminal basin. Every degree of warming increases the rate at which the lake evaporates. The system is terminal by nature, meaning it has no outlet, no escape valve, and no capacity to export its problems elsewhere. What happens upstream does not flow away. It accumulates. The lake is the ledger, and right now, the ledger shows a deficit. The uniqueness of the system, its extreme salinity, its role as a hemispheric bird sanctuary, its terminal hydrology, makes it both irreplaceable and extraordinarily vulnerable. The mechanism is simple. Inputs minus outputs equals change. The loss is already visible. Exposed lakebed, crashed shrimp populations, vanished birds, and dust storms carrying toxics towards cities. The Great Salt Lake is not just shrinking, it is transforming into a public health hazard, powered by the same forces that once sustained it. Thanks for watching. If this breakdown clarified how a terminal lake can be engineered into a dust bowl, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me, should we look at a polluted tropical river or another shrinking inland sea next?